can't hear the...
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us for our Practitioner Education Series webinar on building audit findings, swimming pool compliance. My name is Stuart Draffin and I'm the Director of Audit and Inspections at the VMIA. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we are gathered. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and we recognise and value the ongoing contribution of Aboriginal people and communities to Victorian life. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, we safeguard Victoria's future livability. Our role is not to set policy, but to support industry to understand and comply with the rules. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly and in discouraging risky, harmful or illegal behaviour in the building and plumbing industries. Our Practitioner Education Series is made up of a combination of masterclasses and essential safety measures webinars. This series is aimed at the building industry and will help support the industry by providing practical insights, evidence-based strategies and useful resources. Today's webinar is all about the building audit findings, swimming pool compliance. Today our presenter is Keisha Wozniak, who is the Manager of Building Audit in the Audit and Inspections team. Keisha has a Bachelor of Construction Management and Graduate Diploma in Building Surveying. He has worked as a building surveyor in local governments in Western Australia, where he's registered as a Level 1 Building Surveyor Practitioner before joining the VBA in 2019. Since May 2021, he's been a manager of the Building Audit team. Before I begin, I'd like to just go through a few housekeeping issues. Firstly, everyone needs to be aware that today's session is recorded and will be made available after today. We will be conducting live polls, which will appear automatically on your screens. Questions can be submitted and voted on via the Q&A function. And I'll now pass over to Keisha, who will provide the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart, and welcome everyone. Today we'll be running through the Act and the regulations and the relevant performance requirements that we assessed as part of our building audit program. We'll also be looking at the structural requirements, AS 1926.1, safety barriers for swimming pools, including barriers, gates, other barriers and rigidity, and AS 1926.2 and AS 1926.3. As part of this presentation, we won't be really looking at the existing pools and inspections. We'll cover that off in future webinars, I'm sure. Also, as the majority of the swimming pools that we did our audits on are associated with Class 1A buildings, this presentation will be mainly in the context of Volume 2, but obviously the provisions are very similar across both volumes. And also, again, this presentation is in the context of the Victorian regulatory requirements for those of us who may be joining us from different jurisdictions. As Stuart mentioned, any questions, put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them at the end, depending on how much time we've got left. Also, you'll notice throughout the presentation, I've also included in brackets the reference to the equivalent clauses that will be in NCC 2022 when that commences next year. So we've got our first poll question to come up, and hopefully most people have a bit of an idea about this one. So statistically, evidence shows us that the majority of drowning deaths in private swimming pools are children under 2, children under 5, or adults under the influence of alcohol. So we'll just kind of wait for a few of the results to come through there. So just repeating that again. So the statistical evidence shows us that the majority of drowning deaths in private swimming pools are children under 2, children under 5, or adults under the influence of alcohol. So hopefully we're getting some of those results coming through now. All right, so hopefully we've got those results now coming up. And yeah, the majority of people have gone for children under 5, and that's the correct answer there. Adults under the influence of alcohol, they're highly represented in drownings in waterways, rivers, and the like. All right, so we'll move into the next part of the presentation. So just some background on the audits. Sorry, my notes just changed there. So at the VBA, we're committed to a vision of safe and resilient buildings so that communities and assets are safe, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. Lives and livelihoods are protected and secure throughout best practice regulation. Victoria's built environments are well designed and built to last. There are around 3,600 swimming pool permits issued in the last year. And as we mentioned in the question, the majority of drowning deaths of children under 5 happen in home swimming pools. In Victoria alone, there have been 27 fatal drownings in private swimming pools and spas over the last 22 years. It's also worth noting more generally, children aged 0 to 4 make up 1/3 of non-fatal drownings. So this is where maybe the child has fallen in the pool, medical assistance was required, ambulances attended, but thankfully the child hasn't passed away. The Victorian coroner found in at least 20 of these fatal cases that the safety barrier was non-compliant, and this is likely to have played a role in the deaths of those children. This is why since the start of 2021, we've conducted over 200 desktop audits on building permit documentation for swimming pools, and this was from 69 unique RBSs, and it was in 49 municipalities across Victoria. So we've kind of stretched far and wide to make sure we're covering off everyone and everywhere kind of across the state. So the regulatory requirements for swimming pools. A building permit must be obtained to build a new or alter an existing swimming pool. Regulation 28 of the Building Regulations 2018 sets out, among other things, that a building permit must clearly show the location of the swimming pool and spa and the barrier on the allotment and demonstrate the barrier's compliance with these regulations. The building permit should also include the precautionary measures for both before and after the swimming pool is filled with water. So this includes temporary fencing. Swimming pool is a defined term in the Building Act. Swimming pool means any excavation or structure, including a spa or relocatable structure, that is capable of containing a water to a depth of 300 mil and most importantly, that is principally used or that is designed, manufactured or adapted to be principally used for swimming, wading, paddling or similar activities. So in our findings, Section 24 of the Act requires the building surveyor not to issue a building permit unless they are satisfied that it will comply with the Act and regulation. As shown in the figures on the screen, where the clause was applicable, there was a high prevalence that there was not sufficient information to determine compliance. And I'll talk more about this as we go through out the presentation. So firstly, we'll discuss the performance requirements that we considered as part of our audits and to determine compliance with Regulation 28. So the key considerations that we considered in the building code was performance requirement P2.1.1, structural stability and resistance, P2.2.4, drainage from swimming pools, P2.7.1, swimming pool access, and P2.7.2 swimming pool recirculation systems. In the absence of a performance solution, the audit considered that a DTS solution was being adopted and considered whether compliance was demonstrated against the relevant DTS clause, including the Australian standard. So the top non-compliances, and these are the ones that were, whilst we didn't have information, these ones we had sufficient information to see. And these were the top non-compliances that we identified. So gate swinging inward rather than outwards, landscaping features reducing the barrier height, including steps and retaining wall, encroachments in non-climbable zones, this included pool equipment, and also there was gaps under barriers not less than 100 mil. Where there was these material non-compliances were identified, the RBS was required to provide evidence that the as constructed was compliant. So we'll move into the first performance requirement that we looked at, being P2.1.1, structural stability and resistance. The performance requirement in volume 1 and volume 2 are basically the same, and they set out a requirement for buildings and structures to comply with structurally, including the design actions that must be considered. So depending on the form of construction, the performance requirement for structural could be satisfied using a DTS solution. The DTS options to satisfy the performance requirement are set out on the screen for each volume, and these requirements are consistent across the volumes. And as I mentioned, up in the top corner, I've got the NCC 2022 version or equivalent. In 88% of the audits, there was sufficient information to determine compliance for structural provisions. This is a really good outcome. Most RBS here relied on certification from a structural engineer. These certifications were to AS 3600 for concrete pools and to AS 1838 for fiberglass pools. It's noted that AS 1838 for fiberglass isn't actually a reference standard in the NCC, so it's therefore not actually DTS, it's a performance solution. And currently we're working with the master pool builders to hopefully get this into the next NCC as a referenced standard so that it can be DTS in the future. So some key considerations for structural when issuing permits and designing for swimming pools are AS 3600 for concrete pool design, AS 1838 for fiberglass pools, the bedding material that will be used under the pools, and also the drainage that will be around it. Also standpipes around fiberglass pools to help reduce the water level, and also the soil classification. I think the soil classification is one of the kind of really key things with swimming pools. It's important that we kind of make sure when we get a fiberglass design or something from an engineer and even a concrete one, and we check it against the soil classification, and also then making sure that we've got the right drainage around the pool. Because if the soil becomes too wet and expansive, it may cause a pool heave and the pool coming out of the ground. And we've seen a few VCAT cases where maybe the soil is a lot wetter than expected, the pool's coming out of the ground, or it's cracking, or other issues, which is causing a bit of trouble for the builders and the clients as well. So moving on to drainage requirements. So P2.2.4 sets out drainage from swimming pools. And it sets out that swimming pools must have adequate means of draining the pool in a manner which will not cause illness to people or affect other property. There are no deemed to satisfy for swimming pool drainage in volume 1 and volume 2. And again, we're currently working with the master pool builders to develop a proposal for change to the NCC to introduce some deemed to satisfy solutions to help kind of make this a bit easier to deal with. So whilst there's no kind of DTS, the main way that we basically saw, and we saw this in 19 audits that that was to have a sewer connection. So basically connecting the drainage part to the sewer. When doing this, there's a few things that probably need to be considered. One of them is making sure you have an approval from the relevant water authority to do this, because in some circumstances, the sewer system isn't actually adequate for handling drainage of a swimming pool, and the water authority won't allow it. So a different solution may be required. Another one as well is that volume 3, the plumbing code, does have a DTS pathway when you are using the sewer, but you'd first need to start with a performance solution in volume 1 or volume 2, and then the plumber can use the DTS provisions when installing that connection to the sewer. So next we'll talk about swimming pool access, and this is going to be more about the barrier now. Performance requirement P2.7.1 swimming pool access sets out that a barrier must be provided to a swimming pool and must be continuous for the full extent of the hazard and be of a strength and rigidity to withstand the foreseeable impact of people, and restrict the access of young children to the pool and immediate pool surrounds, and have any gates and doors fitted with latching devices not readily operated by the young children and constructed to automatically close and latch. The performance requirement can be satisfied through a DTS solution by complying with Part 310.1, which are the acceptable construction manuals, AS 1926.1, 2012 safety barriers for swimming pools, and AS 1926.2 location of safety barriers for swimming pools. Both of these standards are prepared by Standards Australia Committee CSO 34, swimming and spa pools, which include representatives from the ABCB, AIBS, KidSafe, Royal Life Saving Society, some state regulators, and the relevant swimming pool association. So these standards are made by that committee, and kind of, I suppose, with our audits, we're just following what's in the standard. If there's sort of something in the standard which may be too onerous, they're kind of your groups you can go to and advocate to get the standard changed or updated. So we'll move to our next question, which is about AS 1926.1. And the question is, AS 1926.1 safety barriers for swimming pools relates to barriers that are intended to be A, child-proof, or B, child-resistant. So hopefully the poll should be coming up on your screen now. So this is about the barrier around the pool. Is it meant to be A, child-proof, or B, child-resistant? I think most people hopefully have a good idea about this one. It's again kind of in the preface of AS 1926.1 and why this is set out. So we'll just give everyone a few more seconds to pop in an answer about whether they think a safety barrier for swimming pools is required to be child-proof or child-resistant. All right, hopefully we've got a few answers coming through and we can pop the results up there. So we had a bit of a mix there. 36% went for child-proof, 64 went for child-resistant. The answer is B, child-resistant. I think we all have probably experienced children. They're very clever and they have a lot of skills, and it would be nearly impossible to make it child-proof. So basically AS 1926 is trying to make the barrier child-resistant, and again, up to for children under the age of 5 is the kind of what the standard says there. So we'll move into some of the findings about the swimming pool barriers now. So part 310.1, swimming pool specifies how performance requirement P2.7.1 can be satisfied by a DTS solution. It sets out the acceptable construction manuals, AS 1926.1 safety barriers for swimming pools, and AS 1926.2 location of safety barriers for swimming pools. AS 1926.1 specifies the requirements for design, construction and performance of the barriers that will restrict the access of young children to the swimming pool. So this standard includes non-climbable zones, barrier materials and components, gate materials and components, child-resistant elements, loading requirements, and the testing requirements for barrier materials and components and units. AS 1926.2 specifies the requirements for the location of the safety barriers intended to restrict access of young children to the swimming pool. And this standard covers outdoor pools, and indoor-outdoor pools. So the common trends that we found with this on the screen now, generally for non-climbable zones, where we found there was sufficient information to determine compliance, the compliance was achieved. So that's really good. The plans were accurate when they were kind of presented. The non-compliances that we did identify, this included pool pump equipment that would facilitate climbing in non-climbable zones, a retaining wall encroaching in the non-climbable zone and reducing the effective height of the barrier, an internal step encroaching into non-climbable zone 4, reducing the internal height of the barrier, and a boundary barrier that was 1700 rather than the required 1800. With insufficient information to determine whether compliance was actually achieved, the height of all portions of the barrier not nominated, so maybe they had put the, like one side, they said this is 1200, they never put what the boundary barrier or the like was. Also, not including for boundary barriers, the height of those. Where barriers intersected with a boundary barrier, there was insufficient information to determine if the non-climbable zone had been complied with as well. With this, there was a lot of generic guides included in the permit documentation, but it was not relevant or not contextualized, so it was unclear where the requirements were required to be implemented and left to the reader to interpret, which can lead to the incorrect implementation on site. And our proactive inspection team have been out on site and have found a lot of issues with barriers, and I think there's this linkage between that where people have all these kind of list of things that they can do and they don't actually know what they're meant to do in which area. So what is required for non-climbable zones? So the plan should nominate the height of all sections of the barrier, the setback of any surrounding structures or items that may infringe on the non-climbable zone, and the intersection of barriers and the width of those barriers. So I've got an example here, which one of my colleagues has kindly helped with. So this is an example of how a site plan might look, and it's quite detailed, this one, and we've got a few different scenarios going on here. So, you know, when you're doing just a swimming pool, you might not have as much information, but we've kind of tried to cover off every possible scenario that you might get in the standard. So with this pool, we can see that it's got a 1200 high aluminium fence. Got a legend here. We can see on the east and the side we got the east and the south and the west boundaries. So I know I need to check those have NZZ non-climbable zones for 1200 high fencing. And I also know that I'll need to check that the rigidity testing of this element has been passed as well. I can see that there's a boundary fence, which is 1800 high. So I need to check that it has the internal non-climbable zone of 900 down from the top of the boundary barrier, being non-climbable zone 5. I'd also need to check the width of the top rail or the surface of this intersecting to make sure it is more than 50 mil wide. Otherwise, yeah, the intersecting barrier will need to be a height of 1800 and extend not less than 900 from the intersection. I can see the gate swings outward as required, that there are windows I'll need to make sure are either restricted to a maximum opening of 100 mil, or that they are totally covered by bars, or a metal screen with openings not greater than 100 mil, or all of which must be fixed to the dwelling with fasteners that can't be removed with the use of a tool. And that's, I think, one of the important things with windows, is making sure that there's that requirement that they are permanently fixed, and that they can't be just unlocked by a key or the like. You need to actually use a tool to fix them. I've also got a balcony hanging over in this area here. It's hanging over my barrier there. So I need to check whether it's protruding into non-climbable zone 3, meaning the balcony will also need to be brought into compliance with the standard. Plus on the south and east side, I've also got a level change I'll need to check the elevations of, and ensure that the barriers in these locations are 1200 high. So over here, we've got some different levels. We can see some steps here. So we need to make sure that we've covered off the minimum height all the way around. I can see we've got a shed wall forming part of the barrier, but I can see that it's got a note stating that there are no openings that may allow access through the pool area. What else I've got? I noticed that there's also an above ground swimming pool, spa rather, on the property, and that there is a barrier and a gate surrounding the steps only. Clause 2.9 of the standard allows walls of factory fabricated pools that are designed for assembly and installation on site, including inflatable pools, to act as an effective pool barrier, as long as that wall complies with the standard, specifically clause 2.1 and 2.3. I'd also need to check whether the non-climbable zone 4 is applicable for this barrier, and making sure that where any of those steps inside the barrier won't be intruding into that non-climbable zone. Also in this scenario, I need to make sure that the spa wall is a minimum 1200 high, and that the non-climbable zones have been applied. And it's important to see whether any of the spa filtration systems as well may encroach within those non-climbable zones. And I need to make sure that there are no objects or level changes within 500 of the spa. Fortunately, in this design, we've got the surface levels there marked out for everyone. So from this this is basically our site plan. We've got a good starting point. We can get all that information that we need to check for compliance. We've obviously got some more things that we'll need to do to check later on, but that's a starting point. So we'll move now to some of the findings with barriers. So like the non-climbable zone, the barrier section of the standard had high compliance rates where the information was detailed. The need to have features and objects that are around the barrier identified on the plan to ensure that they do not facilitate climbing or encroach in the non-climbable zone is highlighted in the coronial inquest into the death of baby Lauren. The barrier for the pool in which she drowned incorporated a barbecue structure. Whilst the coroner couldn't conclusively determine that is how access to the pool area was made, this structure incorporated features that may have facilitated climbing the fence and gaining unsupervised access to the pool area. So one of the non-compliances we picked up with the pool barriers was the ground clearance between the barriers, and on a particular site, the barrier and the ground, the distance was 200 rather than less than 100 as required by the standard. Also, with the insufficient information, we had the setbacks to features and objects near the barrier that may reduce the height, such as retaining walls, not shown. Glass barriers not specified to AS 1288. Fencing material was not nominated, so it couldn't be determined whether it was perforated material or if there were surface projections or indentations, horizontal components within the non-climbable zone, or that the gaps between the vertical components were less than 100 mil. And also the clearances weren't between the bottom of the barrier and the ground weren't nominated on the plans. So what's required for barriers? You should have setbacks to features around the barrier. You should have the glass barrier specified to AS 1288. The fencing material should be nominated, which would include whether it's perforated material or mesh, and the spacing of any vertical or horizontal components. The ground clearance is nominated as 100 mil or less, and having the finished ground levels there, especially where there's level change shown on the plans. So moving on to gates now. So gates are one of the most critical elements in the pool barriers. It's acknowledged that most children who drown in a pool protected by a barrier gain access through the gate or door set. Therefore, it's crucial to ensure that the gate is compliant. The importance of the gate latch was highlighted in the coronial inquest into the death of baby M in Melbourne's West. Baby M drowned in a home swimming pool that was fenced but had a faulty latch. Due to the faulty latch, the child was able to enter the pool area unsupervised. The failure of the gate latch has also come into question in a number of other coronial inquests into children drowning. The coroner concluded in the case of baby M that the death was preventable, which is why it's critical that when approving swimming pool barriers that you have the information on the gate latching device and the hinges to ensure that the product meets the required standard. So some of the non-compliances that we identified are inward swinging gates and the arc of operation of the gate not clear. And then for missing information, we didn't have the gate's location. There was no details of which way the gate was meant to swing. There was no details of the ground clearance under the gate, similar to that with the rest of the barrier. There was no details of the self-closing device or details of the latch operation. And then also no details of shielding of latch or gap between vertical members where that was required. So then we've got another poll question we're going to bring up now as well, and this one's about gates. So when a gate unit is tested in accordance with Appendix F of the standard, it should be capable of complying with the standard after how many operations? So A 1,000, B 5,000, C 10,000, D 100,000. So this is when we test the gate unit, how many times it should be able to operate effectively, close back without and latch before it fails. And I think one of the kind of outcomes of the other coronial inquest was basically that the coroner suggested looking into these testing requirements because the gate hinge and that was maybe the reason why the gate hadn't latched properly and allowed access of the child to the swimming pool area. So hopefully everyone's getting some answers in. All right, so we got some mixes of results there, and the 63%, so the majority are on the mark there. It's 10,000 operations that it needs to comply with. All right, so we'll move on to what's required now for gates. So the plan should show the gate location and that the gate is outward swinging. The gate self-closing device should be nominated. The latch that will automatically operate on the gate closing and prevent it from being opened without being manually released should be shown. The latch location. If the latch is less than 1,500, that there aren't any openings greater than 10 mil or that the latch is shielded. The gate hinges should be specified. The ground clearance of the gate should be specified. Where a gate unit is from a manufacturer. So this is where it's kind of a off-the-shelf gate unit. You should have the written instructions, including the installation instructions, the part list, and an exploded diagram, along with any test reports to confirm that the gate unit has been tested, as we said, to have passed that 10,000 operations. So we've got an example of an elevation on the screen. I can check off a few of those items from this. So I can see the latch location, its height, it's at a height less than 1500 mils, so it must be located on the inside of the barrier and be at least 150 mil from the top of the barrier, both of which are specified. This glass gate doesn't contain any openings, therefore the shielding of the latch isn't required. The gaps are less than 10 mils between the gate and the barrier. The depth of the hinges are specified here, and as they're less than 10 mil, they're allowed to be in that non-climbable zone in 1 and 2. As a note, hinges are also allowed within non-climbable zone 1 and 2 if they have a top surface that's sloped 60 degrees to the horizontal or more. I can see that the ground clearance is less than 100 mil. There's still a few other items I'll need to check off from some of the other plans, and we saw on the other plan we had the gate swinging outward and the arc was clear. And I'd also need to look at the evidence of suitability for the gate unit, and with this one that's been specified, the glass is specified to AS 1288. So now moving on to other barrier components. So some non-compliances we found here was a pool wall that was 1 metre rather than 1200 that was being used as part of the barrier. And then for missing information, we had retaining wall heights not shown, pool wall heights not shown were utilised as part of the barrier. So that, like, this is similar to the spa we had in our first example. No details of the child resistant openable portion of the windows, and no details on the setback of balcony overhang, so we couldn't work out whether the balcony needed to comply or was outside of the non-climbable zone. So what's required for other barriers? So we should have the finished ground levels, height of the retaining wall, details of the child-resistant openable portions of windows, details of child-resistant door sets, and this wouldn't obviously apply to an outdoor pool now, but it would apply to indoor and indoor-outdoor pools. Details of any balconies and their setbacks, and then also pool and spa wall heights when they're incorporated into the design. So we've got this example on the screen here, and I can see that the spa, and I saw that from the kind of, I suppose, it's the site plan, but I can see that the spa wall is part of the barrier, and that it's 1300 high. And then there was also a window that was going to be restricted to 100 mil. So I'd need to check that and make sure that it's got that restriction with the tool and it can't be opened. So moving on now to this is kind of section 3 of AS 1926.1. And that's the loading requirements, and this is basically the loading for the materials that we're using in the fencing. So where there were test reports provided, these were accurate and demonstrated compliance. Generally though, there was no evidence that the material would comply with these tests through a lack of evidence of suitability, and that the material also hadn't been nominated to start with, so we didn't know if it was glass or aluminium or timber or something else. So we've got another question coming up now, and it's to do with loading and rigidity. So that should pop up in the screen in a second. And the question is, do you need to test a glass barrier against Appendix C strength test for rigid barrier components? So Appendix C is in the appendixes, obviously, and it sets out the requirements of how we test barrier components to make sure that they will be suitable for use. So hopefully that's polls coming up on the screen now. I'm not sure if that's come up yet or not. Yep, there we go. So, yeah, just yes or no, do you think that a glass barrier needs to be tested to Appendix C? So hopefully everyone's getting their answers in. We know, I suppose, from earlier on, we talked about glass barriers and they need to be designed to AS 1288. So hopefully everyone's getting their answers in. We'll close this poll off quickly. And we should have the results up now. So this is a bit of a trick question, I suppose, and the answer is actually no. You can't test the glass barrier to this Appendix C because basically you will break the glass if you do that. Sorry, I just took my screen out there for a second. But yeah, the glass, if you tried to test the glass to that, it would break. So the glass needs to be to 1288, and that's got all the testing requirements in there. So moving on to what's required for loading requirements. So testing that vertical components pass the testing of Appendix A. So you should have a test report for that, where you obviously not using a glass one, but you've got another barrier. Posts and footings will withstand the horizontal force of 330 newtons at 1200 above finished ground level. And after loading, there is no permanent damage. Glass is specified to AS 1288. Testing that structural components pass the testing in Appendix C. Flexible materials pass the testing in Appendix D. The strength and rigidity of gate units pass the testing of Appendix E, and the durability of gate units pass the testing of Appendix F. So if you've got a pre-manufactured kind of gate unit or fence unit, you need to make sure you've basically got all the test reports that show that it passes the requirements of the standards. If you're using a custom gate, the requirements are a bit different and to those of from a manufacturer, but you still need to make sure that that kind of custom gate is designed to the relevant loading requirements. So moving on now to kind of the last part of the requirements. So performance requirement P2.7.2 swimming pool recirculation systems sets out that a swimming pool water recirculation system must incorporate safety measures to avoid entrapment of or injury to a person. So part 310.1 swimming pools specifies that P2.7.2 for water recirculation systems can be satisfied via DTS solution by complying with AS 1926.3. AS 1926.3 sets out the requirements for skimmer boxes and other permanent water outlets in swimming pools and spas, and includes the sizing of skimmer box components, materials, testing requirements for outlet covers, and testing for alternative skimming systems. So what we found with the water recirculation, there was basically not a lot of information in a lot of the plans. Where there was the sufficient information with the test reports to support the product that's being used, they were compliant. So the common trends were basically, there were no details of water recirculation devices, or only a manufacturer's brochure had been provided, which did not show any details of the system and how it complied, what size it was, the test reports that show that it works, meets the standard, and also not having sizes of coverings and openings. So I'll go now on to what's required for this. So the sizing of the skimmer box components, including the top access hole size, skimmer box venting systems, what materials are being used in the skimmer box, testing requirements for the outlet covers, testing for alternative systems, where they're used. Where required, the basket access hole is set back at least 100 from the edge of the pool. So this should be shown on the, when you've got a skimming system that has this, you need to show where it is and the setback from the pool edge. So we had one of our audits, or actually two, it was from the same building surveyor, had every single thing perfectly right, and was just this one little thing they missed. So that's one just kind of to watch out for. And the importance with the water recirculation, it's to kind of avoid this entrapment, and there's been a few kind of drownings, and they weren't actually, or near drownings, and they weren't actually kids, they were adults that were swimming in the pool, and they got their hair or something trapped in it, and they got caught under the water and couldn't resurface. All right, so the last thing which I will talk about, and this is kind of outside of what we audited, but it's something that's kind of popping up in prevalence now with people looking for different ways and more eco ways of designing their pools. So these are your natural pools, your swimming ponds, or your recreation ponds that are used for recreational activities such as wading, swimming, paddling, bathing, and they're starting to grow in popularity. These are the kind of the pools that maybe have plants in them or fish or something in them as alternative ways than using chemicals to treat the water. Now, whilst they may look different from that traditional swimming pool, because they don't, they've got plants in them or fish or something in them, they maybe got rocks or the like, their function is still the same and therefore are defined as swimming pools. So as I mentioned at the start, and I've got it back up on the screen again this time, swimming pool is a defined term in the Building Act, and it means an excavation or a structure that is capable of containing a water to a depth greater than 300 mil. So, a dam is this, but a dam isn't required to comply, because the second part of the definition, which is the most important part of it, says and. So, and that is principally used, or that is designed, manufactured, or adapted to be principally used for swimming, wading, paddling, bathing, or similar activities. So we can differentiate between a dam and just an ornamental pond to these recreational swimming ponds or whatever we want to call them, because of the and part. They're designed to be swam in, waded in. They serve the purpose of being a swimming pool and therefore need to comply. So as I kind of said, they're an excavation that's principally used for the design of swimming, wading, paddling, bathing, or similar activities, and therefore are subject to the requirements of the Building Act. And this is including, they'd be required to have a pool barrier, a building permit, and then also we're required using registered practitioners and having planning approvals. So that's one just to kind of consider in the future. So just lastly, I'll wrap up with a few things that we need to look out for. So kind of the key ones that we have is those obviously outside the non-climbable zones, but I think most people are getting that right when they have the information, but these are kind of some of the other ones that maybe we think about a little bit less, and that's balcony overhang. So it's kind of important to know whether if there's an existing dwelling, it's single story or double story, so we can check, the elevation to see if there's any kind of overhangs or areas where people could enter the pool from above. Having the material and the fence heights nominated for all portions of the barrier, so that when we're out on site, we can know, okay, I need to build this part 1200, I need to build this 1800, I need to build this, this can be 1800 because it's all climbable or whatever. Any openings in walls used as part of the barriers, we need to have those detailed, including the windows. So we saw in that example with we had the shed, and we had a note there to say that there was no opening, so we knew that was fine. Having the landscaping features that might reduce the height detailed, e.g. steps, garden edges, and walls. So we've seen that on some of our audits where there's kind of a garden bed and there was no kind of heights about the garden bed edging and that sort of stuff, which could have been used as a step and reduced that kind of height of the barrier. Having the required evidence of suitability, that the material or component is suitable. So that's that testing to support the product that's being used. And then also kind of when we have this information provided on the plans, that it's relevant and specific to the situation. So only including that information that's relevant to the specific site and that the information is contextualized. So If you're putting in a glass barrier, don't include information about an aluminium barrier because that's just going to confuse the situation. So what are the next steps from here? So hopefully from this presentation, you've kind of gained an understanding of what information is required to ensure that the swimming pool and swimming pool barrier permit will be compliant. And as I kind of said, by getting the plans right, we can hopefully avoid issues rising on site with the as constructed that consumes time and money and may, require costly rectification in the owner or the client being upset. And this will help ensure that the pool barriers are compliant and we can play our part in reducing pool drownings. At the VBA, we will continue to monitor swimming pool permits to ensure that there is an improvement in the quality of the permits and also continue to educate those in the industry on what is required. We're also currently, as I mentioned, working with the master pool builders and other industry groups to educate and make changes to the code that will make the approval process easier and ensure that the safety standards are maintained. Also, we're developing further guidance to assist industry in understanding what is required, and we'll include sort of some worked examples of what's required as we've kind of shown already through the presentation, so people can kind of look at them and see what they should be doing or having on the plans. And then I'll just say lastly, like we always welcome any feedback. So if you have any feedback about our audit program or this presentation, you can send it through to us and we'll take that on board and look at it and see how we can implement it. Just some further resources. The VBA has got on our website some practice notes. So we've got SPO1 and SPO2. Also there's some links to some other guidance and guides to and also registration requirements. And you can also find the full report. There's should be 2 up there now about swimming pools that we've done over the last period. And this is also, you can find our class 2 audit report there as well. And also in this location on the website, you'll find our proactive inspections and our compliance enforcement reports as well. So you can see what action we're taking with our inspections and also what action we're taking against practitioners, builders, plumbers, etc. In the future. So thank you for listening. We've got some time for some questions. I actually do already have some questions that we received prior to today's event, and I'll answer those 3 first. Now they are actually about existing pools, but I think it's worth kind of touching on them because there's some interrelation, I suppose, with new pools and what's required. So the first question is about AS 1926.1 1993. So it's obviously the older standard. And it talks about clause 2.3 fence height. And it says, seems to be a lot of discussion on non-climbable shrubs within 1200 mil radius. It states non-climbable items can be within the 1200 radius zone. Most shrubs, when stood on, are greatly reduced the 1200 mil fence height. Are these shrubs acceptable because they are non-climbable? So this clause is probably comparable to the non-climbable zone requirements in non-climbable zone 2 in the 2012 version of the standard. And this says there shall be no handholds or footholds, objects or plants that will facilitate climbing. So I know shrubs are definitely an area which creates some problems in determining compliance. And I think with this, there's got to be a level of professional judgment because every plant's different and the situation will always be different. But there are some things that I would suggest when considering these plants. So, and just firstly, I'll say, hopefully the Standards Committee is considering how plants and vegetation will impact non-climbable zones in the next version of the standard. So hopefully we'll get some kind of clarity about that for the future. But for the time being, what I would consider with the vegetation is, are the plants climbable or are they going to facilitate climbing? So If we had a smooth tree trunk that was 5 meters kind of until there was any branches, didn't have any footholds, we could say this is non-climbable. And if the plants are non-climbable, then they're permitted to be in the non-climbable zone. If the plant would facilitate climbing and encroach into that non-climbable zone, then I would say they would not be permitted. And in this example, it sort of said, it mentioned that if the shrubs, when stood on, they reduce the height, then I'd say they're not permitted because they would facilitate climbing and reduce that height. So the second question is about clause 2.2 of AS 1993 again. It's related to outside surface. And the person says, I've been enforcing that 1100 be maintained from the top of the bottom gate hinge to the top of the fence. Gate hinges have a horizontal surface and depth greater than 10 mil. Is this the correct approach? So I'd agree with the approach that the hinges that are greater than 10 mil depth are projections and therefore required to be at least 900 apart, and the lowest hinge more than 1100 from the top of the bottom gate. In the 2012 version of the standard, with a depth greater than 10 mil, they're not permitted in non-climbable zone 1 and non-climbable zone 2. And then there's also some extra requirements for glass barriers as well. And then the last question, also relating to AS 1993, clause 2.14 or 2.14. This question relates to the self-closing sliding screen doors from the dwelling with direct access to the pool area. After opening these doors, holding open, the screen door latch can be locked with a key, and then the latch doesn't engage with the keeper. Does not latch in the closed position. These latches can be adjusted during operation of the door, but in AS 1993 or AS 1926.193 does not cover this requirement, so I gather it can't be enforced. This is probably complicated, especially from an enforcement point of view, and probably the reason why the 93 standard recommends not having doors and why it's been kind of removed from newer versions. But some of the things that I kind of consider with this is the standard requires the door to be fitted with a self-latching device that will automatically operate on the closing of the door and will prevent the door from being reopened without manual releasing the device. The door is also required to be self-closing and the latch work from any position. The closing and latch of the door shall comply with clause 3.4. In the 2012 version, obviously direct access isn't allowed from an outside pool, but you could have the child resistant on an indoor or part indoor outdoor pool. I think whilst the standard doesn't complicitly deal with this particular situation, the interpretation that I would take is that the latch has to be self-closing from any position, and this element of the latch prevents it from self-closing from any position. Therefore, it's probably non-compliant, but how you deal with that is probably quite tricky. So sorry, I can't answer that question fully, but that's probably the approach that I would take. So that's the pre-questions. We've got maybe 2 minutes. I can hopefully maybe answer one more before we wrap up.
Thanks, Keisha. Through your presentation, we've been receiving questions online, many of which have been endeavoured to respond to online. Quite a few of the questions that have been provided are quite specific and technical in nature. So what we're going to do is take those offline and provide a response to the question once we've had due consideration for the details associated with it. So what we've certainly noted in the nature of the questions is a clear desire for clarity on technical components, but also an understanding of the broader perspectives which we've supplied answers to as your presentations progressed. I just wanted to thank Keisha and everyone for attending today. I think we'd all agree that this is a particularly important topic. At the end of the day, we all have a role to play in ensuring public and community safety, particularly when you look at the statistics around children of 5 years and under. Whatever we can do to improve pool compliance and the safety around pools for all users and all members of the community is particularly important. Keisha's taken us through the relevant standards and deemed provisions. and how we can seek to achieve compliance. He's also been quite instructive in sharing with us the highlights, or what we might refer to as the lowlights, of non-compliance, such as climbable features, reducing the effectiveness of barriers. And we know that the effectiveness of a barrier as a restriction is critical to public safety. He also took us through the issue of latches and gates, etc., and how critical they are. Unfortunately, he was able to draw on some tragic events that have been through coronial inquiries, and they've served to highlight the importance of this topic and the importance of getting pool safety right. So I absolutely thank you all for attending today. The numbers of people attending has been particularly high, which says that everyone takes this seriously. I value the fact that you've all attended. I will highlight also that we are in a process of preparing to stand up in the new year some field auditing of pool barriers, along with pool barrier inspectors, to look at the practical application of the provisions and to look at the on-ground outcomes that are being achieved. At the end of the day, we're all keen to ensure that the level of pool safety is enhanced and that members of the community, particularly children, are kept safe around pools. Thank you everyone for your attendance and your interest in this topic. We'll endeavour to maintain the currency of this information, and we look forward to working with you to improve community safety around pools. Thank you.